She thought the darkness of the mine would swallow her whole. Instead, it became the place where she finally found her light. At 61 years old, discarded by the man she had devoted 27 years to, stripped of the home she had filled with warmth, the car she had driven her children in, and every dollar of the savings she had quietly built over decades, Sylvia was left with nothing but a crumbling deed to an abandoned copper mine that the lawyers barely bothered to mention. What Gerald never anticipated, what Sylvia herself could not have imagined, was that when you strip a woman of everything she thought she needed, you don't break her, you accidentally set her free. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The drive to Harlan Creek took 3 hours on roads that grew narrower with every mile. Sylvia gripped the steering wheel of the rental car. She'd had to rent one because Gerald had taken the Subaru, along with everything else that mattered, and watched the landscape shift from suburb to forest to something older and forgotten. The GPS lost signal 40 minutes before she arrived. She almost turned back twice. The sign for the Harlan Creek copper mine was rusted so completely that the letters were barely legible. A chain-link fence had been cut open at some point, the gap wide enough for a car to pass through, and Sylvia pulled in slowly, tires crunching over gravel and broken glass. She stopped the engine and sat very still. The silence here was different from the silence of the empty apartment she'd been staying in for the past 2 weeks. That silence had been accusatory, full of absence. This silence was ancient, indifferent, something that had existed long before her heartbreak and fully intended to outlast it. Sylvia was 61 years old. She had silver hair she wore in a short, practical cut. Gerald had always preferred it longer, softer, more feminine, whatever that meant to a man who stopped really looking at her sometime around their 15th anniversary. She had reading glasses she was always losing and finding. She had a bad hip from a fall 4 years ago that had never quite healed right. She had a teaching degree she had used for exactly 3 years before Gerald's career required them to relocate, and relocating meant her own career became something that was always going to be sorted out later, and later never came. What she also had, though no one had thought to mention it in the divorce proceedings, was 27 years of stretching a household budget until it yielded something beautiful. 27 years of painting walls, reupholstering chairs, turning bare rooms into places people felt welcome. 27 years of skill the world had never thought to call skill because it happened inside a home, wasn't paid for, and therefore apparently didn't count. Gerald had counted it least of all. He had taken the house in Millbrook, the one Sylvia had chosen, negotiated for, spent a full summer restoring from near ruin, along with the joint savings account, the newer of the 2 cars, and, in a move that still made her jaw tighten when she thought about it, the antique roll-top desk that had belonged to her mother. His lawyer had argued it had appreciated in value during the marriage and was therefore a marital asset. Her lawyer had not argued back nearly hard enough. The drive to Harlan Creek took 3 hours on roads that grew narrower with every mile. Sylvia gripped the steering wheel of the rental car. She'd had to rent one because Gerald had taken the Subaru, along with everything else that mattered, and watched the landscape shift from suburb to forest to something older and forgotten. The GPS lost signal 40 minutes before she arrived. She almost turned back twice. The sign for the Harlan Creek copper mine was rusted so completely that the letters were barely legible. A chain-link fence had been cut open at some point, the gap wide enough for a car to pass through, and Sylvia pulled in slowly, tires crunching over gravel and broken glass. She stopped the engine and sat very still. The silence here was different from the silence of the empty apartment she'd been staying in for the past 2 weeks. That silence had been accusatory, full of absence. This silence was ancient, indifferent, something that had existed long before her heartbreak and fully intended to outlast it. Sylvia was 61 years old. She had silver hair she wore in a short, practical cut. Gerald had always preferred it longer, softer, more feminine, whatever that meant to a man who stopped really looking at her sometime around their 15th anniversary. She had reading glasses she was always losing and finding. She had a bad hip from a fall 4 years ago that had never quite healed right. She had a teaching degree she had used for exactly 3 years before Gerald's career required them to relocate, and relocating meant her own career became something that was always going to be sorted out later, and later never came. What she also had though no one had thought to mention it in the divorce proceedings, was 27 years of stretching a household budget until it yielded something beautiful. 27 years of painting walls, reupholstering chairs, turning bare rooms into places people felt welcome. 27 years of skill the world had never thought to call skill because it happened inside a home, wasn't paid for, and therefore apparently didn't count. Gerald had counted it least of all. He had taken the house in Millbrook, the one Sylvia had chosen and negotiated for, spent a full summer restoring from near ruin, along with the joint savings account, the newer of the two cars, and, in a move that still made her jaw tighten when she thought about it, the antique roll-top desk that had belonged to her mother. His lawyer had argued it had appreciated in value during the marriage and was therefore a marital asset. Her lawyer had not argued back nearly hard enough. Dawn came the way it always does, indifferent to whether you are ready for it. Sylvia woke on the concrete floor of the equipment shelter, her coat pulled over her like a blanket, her hips screaming, her back a solid wall of pain. For a moment she didn't remember where she was. Then the smell of iron and damp earth reminded her, and the weight of it settled back over her chest like something physical. She was 61 years old. She was lying on a cracked concrete floor in a rusted metal shelter on the edge of an abandoned copper mine in rural Pennsylvania. She had 2 suitcases, a rental car she needed to return by Friday, and $318 in her checking account after the security deposit she'd lost on the apartment. She had no job. She hadn't worked in a classroom since before her youngest was born, and the world had kept moving while she stood still inside Gerald's life. She had children who called their father first, and her second, if at all. She had a hip that hadn't been right in 4 years, and hands that had started showing the first stiffness of what her doctor quietly suspected was early arthritis. She had none of the things the world uses to measure whether a person matters. She got up anyway. There was nothing else to do. The first 3 days were about basic survival. She cleaned the shelter with a focus that was less determination than desperation, sweeping out broken glass and debris, dragging rusted equipment outside piece by piece, arms shaking with the effort. She found a tarp folded behind a collapsed shelf that was still mostly intact and used it to cover the section of roof that had caved in, weighting the edges down with chunks of stone she hauled from the mine entrance. The work was brutal. Her body told her in no uncertain terms that it was 61 and had not signed up for manual labor. She kept going because stopping meant sitting still, and sitting still meant thinking, and thinking was something she wasn't ready to survive yet. She established a routine the way shipwreck survivors do, not out of optimism but out of necessity. Wake at first light, wash her face with bottled water from the case she'd bought before the rental car went back, eat something small, work until her body forced her to rest, eat again, sleep as soon as darkness fell, because the nights were cold and staying awake in the cold was its own particular kind of suffering. She spoke to no one. No one called. Gerald didn't call. Her son, Marcus, sent one text on the 4th day that said, "Just checking in, hope you're settling okay," as though she had moved into a pleasant studio apartment rather than a condemned industrial ruin. She didn't reply. Her daughter Renee didn't reach out at all. Sylvia told herself that was fine. She told herself this so many times it started to sound like something other than a lie. On the 6th day she found water. She had been exploring the far side of the mine property, moving slowly on account of her hip, picking through decades of debris and discarded equipment when she heard it, a faint, steady sound beneath the ambient noise of wind and birdsong. She followed it to a place where the hillside curved and the ground was darker, wetter, and there, seeping from a split in the rock face with quiet, absolute persistence, was a natural spring, clean and cold and steady. Sylvia crouched beside it, knees protesting, hip burning, and held her hand beneath the flow. The water was shockingly cold against her palm. She watched it run between her fingers and felt something inside her shift, small but unmistakable. Not hope exactly. Something quieter than hope. Something closer to the recognition that the earth here was still giving something, even after all the taking. This land had been excavated ruthlessly for decades, stripped of its copper and its value and its purpose, and then abandoned the moment it stopped being profitable. And yet here was water, still flowing, still offering something. Sylvia sat back on her heels and looked at her hands. These hands had made every house Gerald picked feel like a home, had painted walls and stripped floors and reupholstered furniture and arranged rooms so that light fell exactly right. These hands had cooked thousands of meals, raised 2 children, held a household together with invisible, unacknowledged effort for 27 years. Gerald had looked at these hands at the end of it all and found them insufficient, but they still worked. They were stiff and aching and mapped with the early marks of arthritis, and they still worked. Sylvia filled an empty bottle from the spring and carried it back to the shelter. She set it on the one shelf that hadn't collapsed, sat down and looked at it for a long time. One thing at a time, one day at a time, one small discovery at a time. She was still here. That would have to be enough for today. The storm came on a Tuesday in early November, and it came without mercy. Sylvia had seen the clouds building since the previous afternoon, heavy, greenish-gray formations stacking themselves against the ridgeline like something with intention. She had spent the remaining daylight hours reinforcing the tarp over the collapsed roof section, dragging more stones to weight the edges, nailing a strip of corrugated metal she'd found partially buried in the ground across the most vulnerable seam. She worked until her hands were too cold to grip properly and the light was gone completely. She told herself it would hold. It did not hold. The rain started around midnight, and within an hour it had become something Sylvia had no accurate word for. Not a storm, a verdict. Water came through the roof in 3 places simultaneously, thin streams that quickly widened into steady pours. The tarp she had reinforced so carefully lifted at one corner in a gust of wind and cracked back like a whip, letting the full weight of the rain in. She grabbed a bucket. She had found 2 in the debris pile and kept them for exactly this kind of emergency, and started bailing, moving from puddle to puddle, trying to keep ahead of it. She couldn't keep ahead of it. By the second hour, the concrete floor was sheeted with water. Her suitcases were elevated on the one remaining shelf, and a stack of flat stones she'd arranged beneath them. Everything else was wet. Her blankets were wet. Her coat was wet. She was wet, soaked through in the way that reaches the bones and stays there, the kind of cold that stops feeling like temperature and starts feeling like a condition. She worked through the night anyway, because what else was there? The storm lasted 2 full days. By the end of the first day, Sylvia was shivering so continuously that the muscles in her shoulders ached from it. She had stopped being able to feel her feet properly. The cough she had been ignoring for the past week had deepened into something rattling and persistent that frightened her when she listened to it too closely. She ate the last of the crackers she had been rationing and told herself the rain would stop soon. The rain did not stop soon. The second night was the worst. Delirious with cold and exhaustion, Sylvia sat on the elevated shelf beside her suitcases, the only dry surface remaining, with her knees pulled to her chest, and thought about Gerald. Not with anger. That would have been easier. She thought about him with a hollow, nauseating clarity. She thought about how he was sleeping right now in the Millbrook house, in the bedroom she had repainted twice to get the color exactly right, in sheets she had chosen, under a roof that didn't leak because she had noticed the gutters needed replacing 3 years ago and arranged for someone to fix them. She had made everything work. She had made everything beautiful and functional and warm. And he had looked at all of it, looked at her, and decided she was the unnecessary part. The thought didn't make her sad. It made her furious. The fury came up from somewhere so deep and so long compressed that when it arrived like the storm had, without warning and without mercy. Sylvia slid off the shelf into the shallow water covering the floor, stood up straight despite the shivering and the rattling cough, and the hip that sent pain shooting down her leg with every step, and she screamed. Not words at first, just sound. Raw and ugly and entirely real, bouncing off the rusted metal walls and disappearing into the rain. Then words. I am not dying in here because he decided I was expendable. I am not disappearing because it was convenient for him. I am 61 years old and I am still here and I still matter and I am not finished. She grabbed a bucket and waded out into the rain. She knew it was pointless. The mine property was flooding faster than any bucket could address. But she needed to do something with her hands, something with the fury, or it would consume her from the inside. She hauled water and threw it and hauled more, soaked to the skin within seconds, rain hammering her shoulders. On her 4th trip she stumbled near the mine entrance and caught herself against the rock face. Her palm pressed flat against the stone, and beneath her hand she felt something she hadn't noticed before, a section of the rock that was fractured differently, a seam running vertically where 2 geological layers met, and from that seam, even in the chaos of the storm, there was warmth. Faint, almost imperceptible, but real, geothermal warmth rising from deep underground. The earth, even here, even abandoned, was still generating heat from its core. Sylvia pressed both palms against the warm stone and stood in the pouring rain and felt something shift inside her chest. Not defeat, not even hope yet, but possibility, small and stubborn and impossible to ignore. The storm ended on the third morning the way storms sometimes do, suddenly, completely, as though it had never happened at all. Sylvia stepped outside into a silence so clean it almost hurt. The sky was pale blue and enormous above the tree line. Every surface glittered with leftover rain. The mine property looked different in the aftermath. Washed raw, the amber and rust colors of the mineral-stained ground deepened and saturated, puddles everywhere reflecting sky like scattered mirrors. A pair of crows picked through the debris near the mine entrance, unhurried and entirely unbothered by her presence. She stood and looked at all of it for a long moment. Then she went back inside, wrung out her blankets, spread them over the outside of the shelter to dry in the thin autumn sun, and made a decision that had nothing to do with hope and everything to do with stubbornness. She was not going to keep simply enduring this place. She was going to change it. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She started with water, the way she had started with everything practical her whole life, by identifying what was essential and working outward from there. The natural spring on the far hillside was still flowing, unaffected and unimpressed by the storm. Sylvia spent 2 days searching the debris piles across the property and found, buried under a collapsed lean-to at the back of the lot, a collection of old copper pipe. Appropriate, she thought, for a copper mine. Some of it was crushed beyond use, but enough of it was intact. She had never laid pipe in her life. She figured it out anyway. Trial and error, which mostly meant error, then more error, then something that almost worked. Then, on the fourth attempt, with hands so sore she had to stop every 20 minutes and press them flat against her thighs until the aching subsided. Something that actually worked. A channel of copper pipe running from the spring along the hillside and down to a collection point she'd created outside the shelter using a broad flat stone she'd dragged into position. Clean, cold, running water, available without a 40-minute round trip on a bad hip. She stood and watched the water run along the pipe and collect in the stone basin and felt something she recognized distantly as pride. She hadn't felt it in a very long time. Gerald had not been a man who made space for other people's pride. The shelter came next. She attacked it the way she had always attacked a room that wasn't working, methodically, starting from the bones and moving outward. She reinforced the walls using flattened pieces of metal she salvaged from the debris field, hammering them into place with a mallet she found in a rusted toolbox that also yielded 3 screwdrivers, a hand drill, and a collection of mismatched screws and bolts she sorted into an old tin can and treated like treasure. She redid the roof completely this time, layering metal sheets and tarp in overlapping sections so that water would have nowhere to enter, weighting and securing everything until the structure above her felt genuinely solid for the first time. She sealed the gaps in the walls with a mixture of clay-heavy mud from the creek bed mixed with dried grass, pressing it in with her fingers the way she'd once watched a documentary about cob building and thought idly that it looked interesting. It was interesting. It was also exhausting and filthy and made her hands look like she'd been digging her way to the center of the earth. She didn't care. The floor she addressed last. The cracked concrete she couldn't fix, but she could cover it. She spent 3 days collecting flat stones from around the mine entrance, pieces of the sedimentary rock that layered the hillside in stripes of gray and brown and unexpected ochre, and laid them across the floor in an irregular mosaic, filling gaps with smaller pieces, creating a surface that was uneven and entirely handmade, and somehow, despite all of that, beautiful. She stepped back and looked at the floor and thought about Gerald's kitchen, the one she had tiled herself over one long summer while he was traveling for work, the one he had accepted without comment when he came home, the way he had walked across it every day for 6 years without once mentioning it. This floor had no audience. No one would walk across it and fail to notice it. It existed entirely for her. That felt, unexpectedly, like the better arrangement. Outside she began clearing ground, pulling weeds, moving debris, revealing the actual surface of the land beneath decades of neglect. The mine property was larger than she'd initially registered, nearly 2 acres of strange, mineral-rich, oddly beautiful terrain that had simply been waiting under the mess. She was beginning to see what it could become. Not yet what, but beginning to see that something was possible. That was enough to keep her hands moving. December arrived like a punishment. The temperature dropped so severely in the first week that Sylvia's water pipe froze overnight, and she spent an entire morning with her hands wrapped around the copper tubing, trying to coax it back to life with body heat she could barely spare. The fire she had built inside the shelter, a small wood-burning setup using a punctured metal drum she had sealed and vented through a gap in the wall with more salvaged pipe, kept the interior survivable but not warm, not truly warm. She woke every morning to breath that fogged in front of her face and joints so stiff she had to lie still for 20 minutes before she could attempt to stand. She had lost weight. She could feel it in the way her clothes fit, in the new prominence of her collarbone, in the way her face looked in the small mirror she kept propped on the shelf above her stone basin. She looked older than 61. She looked like a woman who had been living in an abandoned mine through a Pennsylvania winter, which was exactly what she was. Her hip had been worsening for 2 weeks. The cold affected it in ways the warmth hadn't, tightening everything around the old injury until some mornings the pain was sharp enough to make her catch her breath. She had developed a cough she couldn't shake. She was rationing the last of the rice she'd bought on her most recent trip into the nearest town, a 40-minute drive she made once a week when her body cooperated. On the evening of December 14th, she slipped on a frost-covered stone outside the shelter and went down hard, her bad hip taking the impact of the fall. She lay on the frozen ground for a long moment, staring up at a sky full of indifferent stars, and performed a quiet internal inventory. Hip, existing pain intensified but no new crack or give. Wrist, bruised, functional. Dignity, she almost laughed at that, almost. She got herself up slowly, went inside, sat on the edge of her mattress frame and looked at her hands, and something inside her quietly collapsed. Not dramatically. Not with screaming or fury the way the storm had provoked. This was different, slower, more thorough, the way water eventually defeats stone not through force but through persistence. The doubt that had been sitting at the edges of her days for weeks finally walked to the center of the room and sat down and refused to leave. What exactly was she doing here? She had transformed the shelter, yes. She had laid pipe and built a floor and reinforced walls and cleared ground. She had done things with her hands she had never done before, and discovered capacities she hadn't known she possessed. But for what? For whom? There was no one here to see it. Her children hadn't visited. Marcus sent occasional texts she answered briefly. Renee had gone entirely quiet. Gerald had moved on with a completeness that suggested she had never existed. The world she had spent 27 years maintaining had continued without her, and found the transition entirely manageable. She picked up her phone. The screen showed her the things phones show you when you are trying not to feel alone. Notifications, news, the flat blue light of a world carrying on. She found a photograph from 3 years ago. A dinner party she had organized at the Millbrook house, the table she had set with her mother's china, candles she had found at an estate sale, and arranged just so, food she had cooked for 8 hours while Gerald entertained guests in the other room. In the photograph she was standing at the edge of the frame, half turned away, carrying a dish, caught mid-motion, a background figure in her own home. She hadn't noticed that when it was taken. She noticed it now. Sylvia set the phone face down and looked around the shelter, at the mosaic floor, at the painted walls. She had found 3 cans of usable paint in the debris field weeks ago and spent a careful afternoon covering the worst of the rust stains with a warm gray that made the space feel intentional rather than merely salvaged. At the small shelf where she kept the objects she had found on the property that she considered beautiful, a piece of malachite, no larger than her thumb, green as something alive, that she had discovered wedged in a crack near the mine entrance. A length of copper ore still threaded through its host rock, glinting in firelight. These things were beautiful. She had made this space beautiful, and she was the only one who would ever know it. She lay down and pulled her coat over herself, and stared at the ceiling and thought about stopping. About what stopping would actually mean, about whether the world would register it as anything other than background noise. Her eyes drifted to the piece of malachite on the shelf, green as something alive. She stared at it for a long time. The malachite didn't speak to her. It wasn't that kind of story, but Sylvia lay looking at it in the fading firelight and thought about what it actually was. Copper ore, transformed by centuries of chemical reaction into something vivid and green and entirely unexpected. The same copper that had been pulled from this mine for decades, the same mineral that had made this land valuable and then, when the seams ran thin, worthless, transformed by time and pressure and the quiet chemistry of the earth into something no one would call worthless. Something people sought out, collected, kept. The mine hadn't known it was making something beautiful. It had simply been what it was, doing what it did, and the beauty had emerged anyway. Sylvia sat up slowly, fed the fire, made herself eat the last of the rice cold from the pot, because if she believed she mattered, if she was going to insist on that even alone in the dark in December, then she owed it to herself to keep the body that housed that belief alive and functional. She said it out loud to the empty shelter, the way you sometimes have to say things out loud to make them real. I am not a background figure. I never was. Her voice was rough from the cough and thin from weeks of inadequate food, but it filled the small space completely. She said it again. Then she lay down and slept, and in the morning she got up and went back to work. By late February, the mine property was unrecognizable, not transformed in the way that word gets used carelessly, meaning slightly improved, refreshed, touched up around the edges. Unrecognizable in the absolute sense. A visitor from November would have stood at the property entrance and genuinely questioned whether they had the right address. Sylvia had expanded the water system until it ran in a channel along the full length of the hillside, spilling at intervals into 3 collection basins she had constructed from flat stone at different elevations, creating a series of small cascading pools that caught light and made sound. The sound was the thing she hadn't anticipated, the way moving water filled the previously oppressive silence of the mine property with something living, something that made the place feel inhabited rather than abandoned. She would stop work sometimes just to listen to it. She had built a proper garden bed in the sunniest section of the property, constructing raised edges from the most beautiful pieces of mineral-stained stone she'd collected over months of exploring, filling the interior with composted plant matter and the naturally rich mineral soil she'd discovered beneath the surface debris. Seeds she'd found in a paper bag in the back of the tool chest, unlabeled, of uncertain age, had been planted with more hope than expectation and had responded with a generosity that still surprised her. Green things pushing up through dark earth, proof that dormant wasn't the same as dead. The mine entrance itself she had transformed most dramatically. The rusted steel gate she had removed entirely with 2 days of patient work and a wrench set from the salvage toolbox, cleaning and treating the frame and rehanging it so it opened properly and didn't drag. The stone arch of the entrance she had cleared of decades of accumulated debris and moss, revealing the actual craftsmanship of the original stonework, fitted blocks of local sandstone that the miners of 1902 had laid with a care and precision that the intervening century had not managed to entirely erase. She had filled the cracks with mortar she'd made from a bag of concrete mix she'd bought on one of her town trips, and hung on either side of the entrance 2 lanterns she'd constructed from salvaged wire and glass she'd collected piece by piece from the debris field. In the evenings when she lit them, the entrance looked like somewhere a person might actually want to arrive. She was standing at that entrance on an afternoon in late April, hands deep in garden soil, deeply and specifically content in the way that only physical work can produce, when she heard a car on the access road. The sound was so foreign that for a moment she couldn't place it. Then she looked up and saw it, a black BMW she recognized immediately, picking its way carefully down the rutted track, stopping near the first collection basin because there was nowhere else to stop. Gerald got out. He was wearing clothes that looked expensive and out of place simultaneously. He had put on weight since October. His hair was fully grey now at the temples in a way that the world would probably call distinguished. He stood beside his car and looked around the property, and his face did something Sylvia watched with careful, quiet attention. It collapsed slightly. The confident arrangement of his features simply collapsed. Sylvia brushed the dirt from her hands and waited. He walked toward her slowly, turning his head as he moved, taking in the water features, the garden, the restored entrance, the shelter with its warm painted walls visible through the open door. When he was close enough she could see his expression clearly. She recognized what was on it. It was the look of a man realizing the magnitude of his miscalculation. "Sylvia," he said. "My God." She said nothing. Let him look. What is this? How did you—" He stopped, started again. "I came to check on you. You haven't been answering your phone. I keep it off mostly. Saves the battery. She paused. I didn't have anyone calling. The words landed between them with quiet precision. Gerald had the decency to look away briefly. He walked the full property without being invited to, the way he had always moved through spaces she had made, with the assumption that they were available to him. She followed at a distance and watched him encounter each thing she had built, watched him stop at the cascading pools, watched him touch the stonework at the mine entrance with something that looked involuntary, watched him stand in the garden and look at green things growing in mineral-rich earth and shake his head slightly. I had no idea you could do something like this, he said finally. I didn't know you had this in you. There it was, 27 years distilled into one sentence. I didn't know either, Sylvia said honestly. I didn't know because I never had the chance to find out. You didn't leave much room for finding out. Gerald turned to look at her directly. I made a mistake, leaving you. I see that now, looking at this, looking at you. I made a serious mistake and I'd like to... No. The word was simple and complete and required no elaboration, but she gave him some anyway, because she had earned the right to speak clearly and intended to use it. You gave me this property because you thought it was worthless. Because you thought I was. You were wrong about both. She looked at the land around her, at the water moving and the green things growing and the stone arch of the entrance standing with its original dignity restored. This place had value hidden in it that you never bothered to look for. So did I. The difference is that I looked, and you never did. Sylvia, I'm not angry, Gerald. I want you to understand that. And it was true, she realized as she said it. The fury of the storm had burned through, and what remained was something cleaner and more permanent. I'm grateful. You gave me the one thing that turned out to be exactly what I needed, somewhere that asked everything of me and gave me the chance to find out what I was actually made of. She gestured toward his car. You should go, thank you for checking. I'm not dying, I'm living. Probably for the first time, really living. Gerald stood for a moment longer, then he nodded once, walked to his car, and drove away up the rutted access road without looking back. Sylvia stood and listened to the engine sound fade and then disappear into the birdsong and the water and the permanent, indifferent silence of the hillside. She was free, not because he'd left. She'd been free of him for months, because she finally, completely, believed it herself. Winifred arrived on a Wednesday in early June with no warning and no explanation beyond a single sentence delivered through the open window of her pickup truck. Someone in town told me a woman was living in the old Harlan Creek mine. I had to see it for myself. She was perhaps 72, with the kind of face that had clearly been beautiful once and had become something more interesting than beautiful with the passage of time. She had white hair cut short and practical, paint-stained hands she didn't apologize for, and eyes that moved across the mine property with an expression Sylvia recognized immediately because she had worn it herself. The look of someone seeing potential where the world had only ever seen ruin. Sylvia let her in. Winifred walked the full property in silence, the way people do when they are genuinely absorbing something rather than performing appreciation. She stopped longest at the cascading water system, watching the way the pools caught afternoon light and threw it back in fragments. She crouched, with some difficulty, knees clearly objecting, beside the garden bed and touched the soil with her fingertips. She stood at the mine entrance and looked at the restored stonework and the lanterns for a full minute without speaking. Finally, she said, My husband passed 2 years ago, and my children think I should sell the house and move somewhere manageable. They use that word, manageable. She said it the way you say a word that tastes wrong. I'm 68 years old, and they want me somewhere manageable. Sylvia understood this in her bones. What do you want? She asked. Winifred looked at her directly. I want to build something. I just don't know what yet. That's exactly where you need to start, Sylvia said. Winifred came back the following Wednesday, and the one after that. Sylvia showed her how to read the land for materials, how to identify which stones were structurally useful and which were decorative, how to assess salvaged metal for integrity, how to see the property not as it was but as it could become with patient, sustained attention. She showed her the malachite she'd found near the mine entrance and explained how it had formed, copper ore transformed by time and pressure into something vivid and unexpected, and watched Winifred hold it in her paint-stained hands with an expression of quiet recognition. Then came Eugenia. She was 58, recently separated, a former accountant who had spent 30 years making other people's numbers work, and emerged from her marriage with the unsettling discovery that she had absolutely no idea what she liked. Not what she tolerated, not what she managed, what she actually genuinely liked. She had heard about the mine property from Winifred, who had mentioned it to someone at the farmer's market where Sylvia now sold vegetables and herbs on Saturday mornings, earning just enough to cover her modest weekly needs. Eugenia arrived with a notebook and a slightly defensive posture, as though she expected to be sent away. Sylvia put her to work immediately in the garden, because she had found that physical work was the fastest way past the armor people wore when they were frightened. Within an hour, Eugenia had removed the notebook from her pocket exactly once, looked at it, put it back, and gotten dirt under her fingernails for what she later admitted was the first time in her adult life. She came back the following week with seeds she'd bought herself. Cordelia arrived in July. She was 64, a retired schoolteacher whose 3 adult children had collectively and kindly and firmly suggested she was perhaps struggling to adapt to living alone and might benefit from a community setting, meaning Sylvia understood that they found her solitude inconvenient to worry about. Cordelia had a dry, precise sense of humor she deployed like a tool, and hands that turned out to be extraordinarily capable once she stopped apologizing for not knowing what she was doing. Harriet came last, in early August. She was 74, the oldest of the group, a widow of 6 years who had spent those 6 years becoming incrementally smaller in response to a world that kept treating her age as a condition requiring management. She arrived quietly, stayed close to the edges of the group for the first 2 visits, and on the 3rd visit arrived carrying a box of mosaic tiles she had driven 40 minutes to a craft store to purchase specifically because she had seen the stonework at the mine entrance and wanted to contribute something. By mid-August, there were 5 of them working the property on Wednesday afternoons. The sound of their voices and their laughter echoed off the hillside and the stone walls of the mine entrance in a way that made the place feel entirely different, inhabited not just by one person's stubborn persistence, but by something collective and self-sustaining. One afternoon, Sylvia sat back on her heels in the garden and listened to them, Winifred and Cordelia in an animated disagreement about the correct placement of a water channel, Eugenia explaining something about soil pH to Harriet with the precise authority of someone who had just learned it herself and found it genuinely thrilling and felt something she had not felt in 27 years of marriage. She felt witnessed, not useful, not functional, not adequately performing the role of someone's wife or someone's mother or someone's background support. Witnessed, seen as herself, specifically and accurately, by people who had chosen to be here and chose to keep coming back. Winifred looked up from the water channel debate and caught Sylvia's expression and smiled the smile of someone who understood exactly what that expression meant because they had felt the edges of it themselves. "You built this," she said simply, gesturing at the property, at all of them. "We're building it," Sylvia said. "That's different. That's better." Harriet pressed a mosaic tile into the border she was constructing along the garden path, deep blue, catching afternoon sun, and nodded without looking up, as though this were simply the most obvious truth in the world and required no further elaboration. The water moved through its copper channels, the garden grew, old hands built new things in the long afternoon light, and the abandoned mine that the world had written off as exhausted and worthless rang with the sound of women discovering, collectively, that they were neither. October came back around the way it always does, with color and cold and the particular quality of light that makes everything look simultaneously beautiful and temporary. Sylvia stood at the entrance to the Harlan Creek copper mine on a Tuesday morning exactly 1 year after she had first pulled up the access road in a rental car, with 2 suitcases and $318, and the specific, hollow feeling of a person who has been informed by someone they trusted that they are no longer necessary. She stood and looked down at what the year had made of this place and felt something she had no single word for, a compound thing, layered like the sedimentary stone of the hillside, made of grief and pride and gratitude and a quiet, unshakable certainty that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. She was 62 now. Her birthday had been in May, celebrated with garden tomatoes she had grown from seeds of uncertain provenance and a long evening sitting by the largest collection pool watching the water go gold in the sunset. It had been the best birthday she could remember. No one had organized it for her. She had organized it for herself, which turned out to make all the difference. Her body was different, leaner, stronger in the arms and shoulders in ways she had never been, even in youth. The hip still complained. Age and old injury didn't negotiate, but it complained the way a working body complains, with the honest pain of use rather than the dull ache of disuse. Her hands were permanently marked by the year, calloused, capable, bearing the faint green tinge of copper that no amount of washing entirely removed. She looked every one of her 62 years and had never felt more completely herself. She heard Winifred's pickup on the access road before she saw it, and then behind it a car she didn't recognize, smaller, newer, driven carefully as though the occupant was uncertain of the welcome. Winifred got out first and then turned back to the passenger door and waited, and from the passenger seat emerged a young woman, perhaps 38 or 40, with the careful posture of someone holding themselves together through deliberate effort. "Sylvia," Winifred said, "this is my niece, Delphine." Delphine looked around the property with wide eyes that were doing the thing eyes do when they are trying to process something the mind hasn't caught up to yet. She was dark-haired and thin in the way that recent crisis produces, not natural slenderness but the worn-down kind. She had the particular expression of someone who has been crying regularly for long enough that their face has begun to carry it as a resting state. "Aunt Winifred told me about this place," she said. Her voice was steady, carefully so. "She told me what you built here, after everything." "Come and see it properly," Sylvia said. She led Delphine through the property the way she had learned to, not with explanation but with space, letting the place speak for itself, the water channels catching morning light. The garden beds, cleared for winter now but still bearing the architectural evidence of what they had produced. The mine entrance with its restored stonework and its lanterns. The shelter, no longer a shelter but a home, small and unconventional and entirely hers, every surface bearing the mark of her specific attention. Delphine stopped at the largest collection pool and stood very still for a long moment. "I'm 39, she said finally, "and I feel like everything is over." Sylvia sat on the stone bench beside the pool. "What ended? My marriage, my apartment, my sense of, I don't even know, my sense of who I am, I suppose. When there's no one left to be something for, you realize you don't know who you are for yourself." "Yes," Sylvia said simply, "that's exactly right." Delphine looked at her. "How did you find out who you were?" Sylvia considered the question honestly. "I stopped waiting to be told. That's the short version." She looked at the water moving through its copper channel, the same copper this land had given for decades, transformed into something that carried life now rather than being extracted for someone else's profit. "The long version is that I came to a place that had been used up and thrown away, and I looked at it and decided that worthless was someone else's judgment and not a fact. And then I had to learn to apply that same logic to myself, which took longer and hurt more." "Did it work?" Sylvia smiled. "You're looking at the answer." Delphine was quiet for a moment. Around them the property carried on its own life. Water moving, birds making use of the pools, the wind through the trees at the property's edge carrying the smell of autumn and mineral earth. "I don't know if I'm strong enough," Delphine said, and her voice lost its careful steadiness for just a moment. "Strength isn't something you arrive with," Sylvia said. "It's something the work makes. You don't need to be strong enough to do everything. You need to be strong enough to do the next small thing. That's all. One stone at a time." The others arrived through the afternoon. Winifred and Eugenia and Cordelia and Harriet, each bringing something, seeds for the spring planting, a length of copper pipe Cordelia had found at a salvage yard, Harriet's seemingly inexhaustible supply of mosaic tiles in colors that always managed to be exactly right. They absorbed Delphine into the afternoon's work with the natural ease of women who remembered what it felt like to be new to this and uncertain, and Sylvia watched her begin to relax incrementally, watched her hands find their way into the soil of the winter garden bed, watched her face change almost imperceptibly as her body remembered that it was capable of making things. As the sun began its early autumn descent behind the tree line, Sylvia sat alone for a moment by the mine entrance and pressed her palm flat against the stone of the arch. The same stone she had restored, the same stone that had been here before Gerald, before the marriage, before every version of herself she had performed for someone else's benefit. The copper ore still threaded through the rock in hairline veins, still there, had always been there. "Thank you," she said quietly, to the stone, to the mine, to the year that had broken her open and refused to let her stay broken. The mine didn't answer, but somewhere inside the hillside, deep in the geothermal dark, the earth was warm, the way it had always been warm. The way it would keep being warm long after Sylvia and her copper channels and her mosaic floors and her cascading pools were memory. That night she wrote in the journal she had kept since February, sitting at the small table she had built with her own hands in the shelter that was now, unmistakably, a home. Delphine came today, 39 and certain her life is finished. I remember that certainty. I remember how absolute it felt, how reasonable, how completely supported by available evidence. I want to tell her, and I will, slowly in the way this place teaches things, which is through the hands and not the ears. That certainty was a story she was telling herself with incomplete information. The complete information is this: you are not the role you performed for someone else. You are not the value they assigned you. You are not finished when they decide they are done with you. You were here before them, and you will be here after. You contain things they never looked for, and you are capable of things neither of you can yet imagine. The mind didn't know it was making malachite. It was simply being what it was, under pressure, in the dark, over time. And what emerged was extraordinary. You are the same. We all are. We just need someone to look close enough to find it. Look close enough to find it in yourself. That is the whole work. That is all of it. Everything else follows. She closed the journal and looked around her home, at the mosaic floor, at the painted walls, at the malachite on the shelf, green as something alive, which it was, had always been, simply waiting to be found. She was 62. She lived alone in an abandoned copper mine in rural Pennsylvania. She had no husband, no conventional life, no one's approval to anchor her sense of her own worth. She was more completely, more authentically, more joyfully herself than she had been in 62 years. And tomorrow there was work to do. There was always work to do, and she was deeply, permanently grateful for it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.